Charles Lindbergh wins the presidency on November 5, 1940, and the world holds its breath. The man who crossed the Atlantic alone in 1927 has now captured something equally improbable, the American imagination in a time of fear. For months, he has barnstormed across the nation, drawing crowds that rival Roosevelt's, telling Americans what many desperately want to hear: that Europe's war is not their war, that the Atlantic Ocean remains America's greatest fortress, that their sons need not die for the quarrels of old empires. The America First Committee, with its 800,000 members, has become the engine of his campaign, and on election night, the impossible becomes real. Roosevelt, seeking an unprecedented third term, watches the returns with growing disbelief. The margin is narrow, closer than anyone expected, but it is enough. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. What no one fully grasps on that November evening is how quickly the consequences will cascade across oceans. Within weeks, Lindbergh signals that Roosevelt's proposed Lend-Lease program is dead on arrival. American neutrality will mean exactly that. But the ripples of this decision will reach shores far beyond America's borders, and they will drown millions before they recede. Britain's dollar reserves run dry by February 1941. Churchill's government has spent everything purchasing American aircraft, ships, and munitions. Under Roosevelt's proposed Lend-Lease, these supplies would have continued flowing on credit, keeping Britain in the fight. Under Lindbergh, the spigot closes. American manufacturers, bound by neutrality legislation and lacking government guarantees, cancel contracts worth hundreds of millions. The shipyards of Newport News and the aircraft plants of California fall silent on British orders. In the North Atlantic, Admiral Karl Dönitz watches this development with predatory satisfaction. His U-boat fleet, still modest in size, has been inflicting grievous wounds on British convoys, but the destroyers Roosevelt had promised, 50 aging but serviceable vessels that could have screened those convoys, never arrive. By spring, wolf packs operate with growing boldness, pushing further west, staying on station longer. Merchant ship losses climb past 500,000 tons monthly. The food rationing that Britain accepted stoically in 1940 becomes genuine hunger by summer, and Dönitz is only beginning to understand how much advantage American neutrality has given him. Erwin Rommel reaches the Suez Canal in October 1941. In our timeline, British forces in North Africa clung on through desperate months, supplied by convoys that threaded through the Mediterranean and around the Cape of Good Hope. But those convoys depended on American trucks, American tanks, American aircraft, and American fuel. Without Lend-Lease, the flow becomes a trickle. Rommel, whose Africa Corps arrived in Libya in February, faces an enemy that cannot replace its losses. The British Eighth Army fights with extraordinary courage, but courage cannot substitute for ammunition. When Alexandria falls, the strategic mathematics of the entire war transform. The Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to India, to Middle Eastern oil, to the resources of an empire, passes into Axis hands. German engineers begin clearing the waterway of scuttled ships within days. Hitler, who had viewed North Africa as a sideshow, suddenly recognizes its significance. The Mediterranean is becoming a German lake, and somewhere in Tokyo, Japanese strategists are watching these developments with intense interest. Operation Barbarossa launches on June 22, 1941, precisely as it did in our timeline, but into a transformed strategic landscape. Hitler no longer faces the prospect of American industrial might backing his enemies. The Wehrmacht crosses into the Soviet Union with the same 3 million men, the same 4,000 tanks, the same confidence in swift victory. But this time, the German war economy operates without the strain of defending Atlantic shipping lanes or reinforcing a collapsing Mediterranean front. Rommel's victory has freed divisions that might otherwise have garrisoned Egypt and Libya. More critically, it has opened the possibility of Middle Eastern oil flowing toward the Reich rather than toward Britain. Stalin, watching Britain's accelerating decline, faces an agonizing calculation. His ideological enemy is winning. His capitalist allies are failing. And the United States, the industrial colossus he had hoped might eventually join the war, sits behind its oceans, led by a man who once accepted a medal from Hermann Göring himself. The Soviet Union will fight alone for far longer than anyone anticipated. But that revelation lies months ahead, buried beneath the snow of a winter that has not yet arrived. Winston Churchill survives a vote of no confidence in November 1941 by 17 votes. The margin tells its own story. Britain is starving. Not metaphorically, literally. The Atlantic convoys that sustained the island have been savaged beyond recovery. Bread rationing has tightened to levels not seen since the darkest days of the First World War. Coal stocks dwindle as colliers fall victim to U-boats within sight of British shores. The population that endured the Blitz with defiant humor has grown gaunt and frightened. Churchill's rhetoric remains magnificent, but rhetoric cannot fill empty stomachs or fuel idle factories. Across the political spectrum, voices whisper what was once unthinkable. Perhaps terms should be explored. Perhaps the war cannot be won. Perhaps survival demands accommodation. Churchill refuses to entertain such thoughts, and for now his force of will holds the government together. But the members of Parliament who voted against him represent something more dangerous than opposition. They represent despair, and despair is spreading through every level of British society like a slow poison. Japan seizes Singapore on February 15, 1942, 3 days faster than in our timeline, against defenders who receive no reinforcement. Britain's collapse in the Mediterranean and near starvation at home has stripped the Far Eastern Empire of any pretense of protection. The forces that might have reinforced Malaya have been consumed in North Africa or retained for home defense. Japanese commanders, watching Britain's agony with cold calculation, recognize that the moment for southern expansion has arrived. The Dutch East Indies fall within weeks. Australia, suddenly exposed, appeals desperately to Washington. But Washington under Lindbergh offers only sympathy. American neutrality, the president insists, applies to the Pacific as fully as to the Atlantic. Japan's expansion threatens no vital American interest. The Philippines remain at peace. American trade with Japan continues. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Japanese naval strategy, begins to wonder if perhaps the American giant can be kept sleeping indefinitely. The southern resource zone is secured. The co-prosperity sphere expands. And still, America does nothing. Japanese aircraft attack American positions in the Philippines on March 8, 1942, destroying half the Far Eastern Air Force on the ground. The decision to strike has been months in the making. American trade restrictions imposed gradually as Japan's expansion continued have finally begun to bite. Lindbergh, pressured by his own cabinet, has reluctantly restricted oil and steel exports. The Japanese military, facing the slow strangulation of their war machine, concludes that conflict with America is inevitable. Better to strike now, while the United States remains unprepared, while its potential allies lie broken or bleeding. But this is not Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Fleet, never moved to Hawaii under Lindbergh's cautious policies, remains scattered across the West Coast. Japanese strategy, designed to cripple American naval power in a single blow, instead faces the prospect of a prolonged campaign against an enemy whose industrial heartland remains untouched. America awakens, finally, but to a strategic nightmare. Britain barely clings to existence. The Soviet Union fights alone against German armies that have reached the gates of Moscow and Leningrad. Japan controls an empire stretching from Manchuria to the Dutch East Indies. The war America enters is not the war it might have fought in 1941. Victory comes on August 19, 1947, 2 years after the atomic bombs fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The road there demands a price measured in millions. American forces fight across a Pacific transformed into an archipelago of fortresses, each island bloodier than the last. The liberation of Europe requires not months but years, as Germany, fed by Middle Eastern oil and African resources, proves far more resilient than the Reich that fell in 1945 in our timeline. The Soviet Union, having borne the war's greatest burden alone for nearly 18 months, extracts territorial concessions that reshape the post-war world. Britain survives, but as a shadow of its former self, its empire dissolving, its influence diminished, its population scarred by years of genuine hardship. Charles Lindbergh does not seek re-election in 1944. The man who promised peace delivers war on the worst possible terms. His legacy becomes a cautionary tale, studied in academies and debated by historians. The cost of neutrality, they conclude, can sometimes exceed the cost of intervention. The oceans that Americans trusted as barriers proved to be highways for consequences they could not escape. In the end, the world's troubles found America regardless. They simply found it unprepared.